Hello, welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down a finals pool match from the Einherjar Cup 2025, which took place in Hong Kong about a month ago. Now, I haven't covered much fencing from the Hong Kong area, and I'd like to change that by reviewing some of this footage. Now, one of the things to pay attention to here is that being in Hong Kong, the fencers here and the tournament organizers here don't have a massive connection to some of the tournaments that you might have seen on this channel before or in your own local area. So we're going to be paying attention to maybe the differences in their rules, the differences in the way they fight, and maybe the differences in how they interpret one another and adapt to one another in order to come out on top. So for our first exchange, we have our longest exchange, which means you get an opportunity to talk about footwork and stances. Now, obviously, both of these fighters are in a right leg forward stance, and they're keeping a relatively high guard, though they're keeping it pretty tight to about the middle of their chest. As the fencers continue on, moving in and out of range, trying to see where the other person might fire off. Fencer on the right in the blue corner here goes for a nice basic hand shot, puts a pretty decent lunge on it, lands it, and then gets back out of range. But one thing to pay attention to that's going to come up a lot in these subsequent exchanges is the fact that they're both in hammer grip. Now, by hammer grip, I mean that their crossguard is aligned with their knuckles. And in a lot of other places, you'll see people use thumb grip. And that is a different grip where your thumb, generally your dominant hand thumb, is on top of the sword touching the flat. And what that means is it's a difference between a crossguard that is aligned with your knuckles for a cut or a crossguard that is parallel to your knuckles, which gives you a little bit of a differences in the kinds of things you can throw and the kinds of defenses you can offer. Now, for our next exchange, we have something that is equal parts interesting, messy, and brutal, which is definitely another theme that's going to come up a lot during these exchanges. But for this one, we have Fencer on the left in the red coming forward with a nice big ballistic thrust, and the Fencer in blue on the right going for a parry. Now, this is where we once again have to bring up the guard that both of these fencers were standing in, and that's the hammer grip. This fencer was in hammer grip and their crossguard was aligned with their knuckles. When they attempted to do the same parry, they did it in a very different fashion. They had to sweep their sword up and around in kind of a U or a C shape in order to get the same effect, and they almost end up transitioning into a full-on hanging parry with their point dangling down by their right side. Now, the thrust that Fencer on the left threw ended up winding down and around underneath of the guard and got harmlessly pushed off to the side by a blue fencer's right arm. So the thrust, in my mind, didn't really land. But what happens after that is that red, who crashes into blue towards the corner of the ring, does a little bit of a hand push. Now, this is something I've talked about in other videos, and the basic idea of a hand push in this scenario is you want to shove both of your hands directly towards the face of your opponent. And the reason you want to do that is because you want to stuff the Zverkow that you know is coming. Blue fencer, who does get hand pushed pretty effectively, simply brings their sword up and around to their right and down onto the head of red fencer, who tries to duck out of the way of it maybe a little bit too slowly. Now, after this exchange happens, and that is the exchange that gets called by the refs, there is another follow-up pretty brutal afterblow strike on the part of blue fencer that just looks to be a little bit out of tempo. Now, it's somewhat understandable because that final headshot that came across the top doesn't seem like it really landed quite great, and the short edge follow-up that blue fencer throws looks like it was more of a desperate attempt to make sure that they got something before they were either shoved out of the ring or had everything thrown out. And so it's somewhat understandable to continue fencing at that point because maybe they just didn't quite feel that they had landed that first attack and they were just going for a second. So skipping a few exchanges ahead, we have what is, in my mind, one of the more egregious exchanges when it comes to late afterblows. And it all happens as a result of the directors and the judges not necessarily getting in there and putting a stop to exchanges on time. But when we watch the exchange itself, what happens here is blue launches forward with another big explosive cut from the right, and they land directly into the hands of red fencer, who did another big sweeping parry up with their hands, but didn't have their crossguard horizontal. So they just got hit. Now, normally, after this point, there would be a little bit of a delay, a little bit of a tempo where both fencers would have the ability to do something before the director had the ability to call halt. And in this case, that something is that both fencers kind of mash into each other, but at this point, neither the director nor the judges have started to indicate that the fight should end, and it most certainly continues. At this point, red fencer pulls off and throws a nice little compass step with a right Zwerchau low to the arms, which definitely lands. At the exact same time as this happens, red fencer pulls off, completely ignores the Zwerch to their body, and rips a big middle house straight to the belly of blue fencer. And then as that afterblow is coming in, again, already 2 tempos too late, blue fencer pulls off and throws an absolutely brutal final Oberhau straight to the head of red fencer, physically moving their head and very likely giving them just a little bit of a concussion. Now, why did all of this happen? It's easy to simply say that the fencers were being especially egregious and they just needed to put a stop to that. And that's not necessarily untrue. But another thing that people have to consider is that when you are running a tournament, it is the job of the director, really more so than the judges, but also somewhat the judges, to make sure that exchanges have a reasonable stop position. If you are not taking accountability for when these exchanges are being called to stop, you also don't have a really great measure as to whether or not someone has gone meaningfully past that call to stop, or if they're doing so intentionally or accidentally. In my opinion, we have already seen an exchange here where blue fencer maybe went a little bit above and beyond when it came to a late afterblow, but it was somewhat understandable because at the very least, they were throwing a strike as halt was called. But in this case, there was plenty of opportunity for halt to be called, and no fencer ever heard it, which meant that they just kept going and going and going, 2, 3, 4 exchanges and tempos after the halt probably should have been called a long time ago. Now, this next exchange is basically identical, and I'm not going to talk at all about what happens in the exchange. You can pretty clearly see for yourself that they just brutally afterblow each other 2, 3 times in a row. But what I want to point out here is something I don't normally do, which is to show off the flags that the judges present after the exchange happens. And something really interesting and important happens here. The 2 judges that we can see in the camera immediately after the exchange is over don't seem to really know what to call. And in a lot of ways, you can understand why they don't know what to call. They just watch 2 people wail on each other like 3 times in a row. Which one are you supposed to account for? And what's very important to understand here is that regardless of how your tournament is ruled out, how people can acquire points, and even regardless of how you maybe determine brutality or late afterblows, one of the important things to consider here is that one of the reasons that people will do this kind of thing is because they are being rewarded it unintentionally by the judges. When you have a messy exchange like this one, and you have people doing late afterblows, one of the key things that you have to make sure to do is to have the director and the judges come forward and make sure to punish one or both fencers for what happened in that exchange rather than award any points. Because the reality here is that the only way you can avoid things like this is if it's not emphasized. And one of the ways that you can unintentionally emphasize exchanges like this is by awarding points to somebody who late afterblowed somebody else 2 or 3 times in a row. At this point, so many late afterblows have happened in this fight that I can no longer blame either blue or red fencer for continuing to do it, because at this point, if you were the one person in these exchanges who wasn't late afterblowing, well, you might have most of your points discarded. You might not be impressing the judges or fulfilling whatever criteria they happen to have. And as a result, if you are running tournaments and if you want to prevent this kind of thing from happening, one of the most important things you need to consider is that you need to make sure that nobody ever gets points on exchanges like this. No matter how bad or silly it might feel to throw out an exchange and say nobody gets points where 2 people pretty clearly got hit, it is very important for the longevity of your tournament scene that this behavior essentially not be considered acceptable. Now, I want to kind of end this on a high note, mostly because I feel like I've basically portrayed this entire tournament as a double fest or a late afterblow fest, and that's just not the case. There were quite a number of instances where that did happen, but there were also quite a number where it did not happen. And this is a pretty good showcase of that exact scenario. We have pretty much, again, an identical exchange as we have seen previously. Blue comes in, hits the hand, and this time you see the judges and the director immediately start calling halt, immediately start calling the end of the exchange. There is still an exchange of blows blows that occurs after or more or less during that halt call. But the final blow that blue throws looks pulled and it goes to the hands, and it doesn't really cause any damage or any injuries. And this is really what I want to showcase as being the kind of thing that I want to see out of this exact kind of scenario. If every single scenario that we saw previously ended up like this one, then I wouldn't have anything negative to say at all, even though theoretically we do have another late afterblow here. And the difference is hopefully pretty clear when you watch the footage. The idea here that I want to try to instill in people is, one, if you have a scenario where you're getting a lot of late afterblows and maybe even people getting hurt, there is something very important that you as the director and the judges and the organizer can do to try to get rid of that. You want to make sure to call halt quickly and early, potentially to the point where you ruin some exchanges, and most importantly, that you do not reward any exchange with points where there was a late afterblow. This will instill to your fencers that they no longer have to try to fence to your view and to fence all the way past the halt in order to make 100% sure that what they throw gets counted. Well, as soon as they know that that is no longer emphasized, I promise you that the good nature of all of these fencers will come out and they will be more than happy to be kind to each other and not harm each other, because ultimately I don't believe that that's what any of them really wanted. So that's what we can learn from this. I really hope to see some really great stuff coming out of Hong Kong in the future. And if you'd like to see more reviews, I will be back next week with some more videos.